This year, global energy markets received a signal already described as alarming. The United States of America, which for decades held the title of the world's largest oil supplier, has begun to rapidly lose its position. According to the latest official data, the volume of American oil exports has fallen by almost 20% compared to last year. For the market, this came as a shock, as the last time such low figures were recorded was back in 1971. At that time, the reason was the oil policy of the Persian Gulf states and the first signs of a crisis of confidence in the US dollar. Today, however, the situation is unfolding for different and far more troubling reasons. Reports from Financial Times and Bloomberg indicate that key US partners in Europe and Asia have gradually begun reducing purchases of American oil, diversifying their supply sources toward the Middle East and even Russia. Sources close to OPEC+ say that this has become a window of opportunity for the cartel, and that Gulf states are already ramping up production in hopes of capturing the market share the Americans are rapidly losing. According to one anonymous analyst familiar with the situation, if the US does not take urgent measures, within 3 to 5 years, its leadership in the oil market could be nothing but a memory. The reasons are complex. First and foremost, analysts point to the harsh trade war launched by Donald Trump. The tariffs and sanctions imposed by Washington have not only disrupted global supply chains, but also forced many countries to seek alternative paths to reduce their dependence on the US. As a result, countries like India and China, which until recently were major buyers of American oil, have begun signing long-term contracts with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Venezuela. Another factor is the rapid weakening of the dollar. According to reports from the Wall Street Journal, many countries no longer see the US currency as a reliable anchor in international trade. Increasingly, oil transactions are being settled in yuan, dirhams, or rupees. This undermines US competitiveness. American oil becomes more expensive for buyers, who are turning to alternative markets. Domestic policy also plays a role. The US is increasingly turning inward, focusing on domestic consumption and limiting export capacity. The Trump administration explains this as a way to protect national interests, but in reality, it only accelerates the shift of clients to competitors. According to Reuters experts, it is precisely this combination of 3 factors, the tariff war, a weak dollar, and isolationism, that has led to the 20% drop already described as historic. Insiders from US oil companies, quoted in reports from S&P Global, admit the situation is critical. Domestic production remains high, but selling it is becoming increasingly difficult. Storage facilities are overflowing, transport costs are rising, and contracts with key countries are shrinking, said one senior executive on condition of anonymity. Against this backdrop, OPEC+ feels increasingly confident. Saudi Arabia and Russia have simultaneously announced expanded exports, while China and India are increasingly positioning themselves as their strategic partners. If the US continues to lose market share, OPEC+ could secure definitive leadership by the end of the decade, leaving America in a secondary role. For the White House, this is becoming a matter of national security. In Washington, they understand that oil is not only about economics, but also about geopolitics. Losing leadership in this sector means the US risks forfeiting its primary lever of influence over allies and rivals. Without control over energy flows, America loses the ability to dictate terms and protect its interests abroad. For now, however, the Trump administration pretends nothing serious is happening. At official briefings, officials claim that the US remains the largest oil producer and supplier in the world. Technically, this is true. For now, the numbers are still in their favor, but the trend is obvious, and it is precisely that trend which raises the greatest concern. History offers many examples where leadership survived only on paper, while real power shifted to other players. Today, analysts at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are already preparing forecasts that warn, if the decline continues at the same pace, by 2027 the US will lose leadership not only to OPEC+, but also to a whole block of new players, including countries in Africa and Latin America. The energy world is changing before our eyes, the experts write. For Donald Trump, this situation is turning into a political trap. On the one hand, his rhetoric rests on the idea that America must be first in everything. On the other hand, it was his trade war that became the catalyst for the crisis. Now, every new report on declining oil exports is perceived not just as economic data, but as a sign of the White House's policy failure. The world is thus witnessing a turning point. The US still holds the lead, but it no longer looks unshakable. The trend is clear: falling exports, disappearing clients, a stronger OPEC+, and rising competition. If America does not change course in the coming years, its era of oil dominance may end as swiftly as the era of the British Empire once did. Of particular importance in this story is the reaction of America's allies. According to The Guardian and Der Spiegel, voices in Europe are growing louder, saying that the US is no longer a reliable partner in the energy market. Germany, which for years relied on American shale oil, is now actively diversifying its purchases. German energy corporations have already signed new agreements with Qatar and Nigeria, and are even considering boosting purchases from Russia through intermediaries, despite sanctions. This looks like a quiet but very telling attempt by Europe to free itself from dependence on the US while preserving energy stability. Asia is reacting even faster. India, which just 2 years ago was among the largest buyers of American oil, has now almost completely switched to long-term contracts with Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Russia. Indian media openly call this a strategic pivot, stressing that Trump's policy of tariffs and pressure effectively pushed New Delhi into the arms of OPEC+. In China, the situation is even more striking. According to the South China Morning Post, American oil is no longer seen as a priority. Instead, Beijing is focusing on expanding imports from Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, which are ready to provide oil not only at lower prices, but also in alternative currencies. For China, this is a major geopolitical step. It ensures energy security while simultaneously weakening the dollar in the global settlement system. Thus, we see a vicious circle. The US cuts exports, partners turn to other suppliers. Partners leave, the US loses markets and influence. The US loses markets, the dollar weakens, and the economy itself falters. This cycle can only be broken by a radical shift in course. But for now, there are no signs that the administration is ready to take this step. That is why experts are already speaking of the decline of the American oil era. According to analysts at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, this process could be as dramatic as the fall of the British pound after the Second World War, when London lost its status as the world's financial capital. Today, the US still holds first place, but its position is cracking. If the trend continues, within the next decade, the world may wake up to a new reality where the main guarantor of energy stability is not Washington, but OPEC+, led by Saudi Arabia and Russia.